to the Explorers. Time traveling through history, one era at a time. I'm Kate Armstrong. Today, we're going to take a short hiatus from the Tudor era and travel to another time and place. It's 1943 in Virginia. World War II is raging across the waters, and American men are being called to fight. But on the home front, girls are being recruited too. Girls like Kit Sutherland, who's asked to become one of the army of female codebreakers at Arlington Hall, a former girls' college now serving as the site of a secret U.S. signal intelligence facility. Kit can't resist the call, even if she isn't quite who she's pretending to be. But Kit is soon involved in another kind of fight. Government girls are being murdered in Washington, DC, and when Kit stumbles onto one of them, she and her code-breaking gal pals are drawn into the hunt for the killer. That's the premise of The Killing Code, a new YA historical novel by Ellie Marney, the New York Times bestselling author of the thriller None Shall Sleep. Atmospheric, compulsive, and deliciously dark, it's the perfect book to kick off the spooky season. And it'll introduce you to a slice of women's history that you might not know that much about. Ellie joined me on the Explorers to talk about the real-life female codebreakers who inspired her novel, as well as life for women in wartime DC in the 40s. So, grab your packaged gravy and your best puzzlin' brain. Let's go traveling. But first, a shout out to some of my patrons. My newest pirate queens, Stephanie, Deborah Lynn, and Emma. My newest and youngest lady president, the wonderful Piper. My boss ladies, Dawn, Amy, Annabelle, Elizabeth M., Grace, Jessica, Sophie, and Julian. Michelle, Monique, Natalie, Nuria, Patricia, Rebecca, Sarah, and Tonya. My adventuresses, Anna, Deborah, Carlos, Emily, Helena, Iris, the two Jessicas, Jo Marie, Phil, Kelly, Stephanie, and Terry. My warrior queens, Ika, Lori, Alexis, June, Neve, and Sloan, and Kate. My imperial empresses, Bridget, Katie, Samara, and Faye and Whimsy Soapworks, and my lady pharaohs, the fabulous Laura and the incomparable Courtneys. Patrons play a huge role in keeping the Explorers going. It's because of them that I was able to hire my amazing research assistant and support writer, Carly, without whom Season 3 just wouldn't be a thing. For just a couple of bucks a month, you can support an independent creator, and you'll get access to exclusive bonus episodes, contests, the Explorers yearly calendar, full interviews with guests, and much more. To find out more about it, just go to my website. Hi, Ellie. Welcome to the Explorers.
Hi, Kate. It is so lovely to be here. Thank you so much for having me to visit.
Oh, well, it's amazing to have you on the show. You and I have been talking about doing this for a really long time as you were working on The Killing Code. So I'm glad to finally be here doing it.
I was going to say, I think you were probably one of my most enthusiastic supporters while I was writing this book. You were very... I would drop by our online channel and chat with friends about how the book was progressing, and everyone was kind of like, "Oh yeah, that's great." And then I would go into all of these bizarre historical details, and you would be like, "Yes, give me more."
Oh, I could not wait to get the manuscript in my hands, and when I finally got to read it, it was amazing, and I loved every minute of it.
Thank you so much.
Before we get into actually talking about the book, can you pitch it for us, please?
Okay, so the book has a name, and
I should
probably mention the name of the book. Okay, The Killing Code is my latest book, and it is set in 1943 when 4 young code girls who work at a secret cryptographic facility called Arlington Hall, just outside of the capital, must join forces to break the code pattern of a serial killer who is murdering government girls in Washington, DC. So that's the main thread of the story. And that's what I've been working on. It sounds very small when you reduce it like that to like one sentence or one phrase, but there was just so much research and so much detail involved in the creation of this book. And I'm really glad I finally get to talk about it with somebody who will appreciate it.
Oh, yeah. If there was ever an audience for The Killing Code, it is definitely you, Exploress listeners. I promise. I have now read the book twice and loved it very, very much both times. So let's get into this a little bit. I want to start by talking about what brought you to this story and this world and this particular piece of history. What made you want to set a book in this time and in this place?
Look, I think I've always been a little bit fascinated with Bletchley Park and the code breaking that happened during World War II. And then a number of years ago, it must have been nearly 5 or 6 years ago now, I watched a show called The Bletchley Circle, which was a BBC production. And it was about 4 women who used to be code breakers at the UK code breaking facility, Bletchley Park, and how many years after the war, so about 10 years after the war, they regroup to investigate and solve a mystery. And I was fascinated by it. I think I watched it a couple of times in a row. It was really that good. And I loved the clothes and I loved the personalities of each individual person. But I mean, I'm a YA author, so my first instinct is always to say, oh, what about this? But teenage girls. So I was immediately thrown into the idea of how good would this be if this was a group of girls all collaborating. And also, I think setting the show a little bit after the war, I was really fascinated in the details of what happened during the war itself. So that part felt like it was really missing to me. And then after I watched the show, I dived into some research around Bletchley Park and just kept reading about it because it was so fascinating. And initially, I thought I would set the book in the UK. But then I read an amazing book, which was sent to me by a friend, called Secret Postings, Bletchley Park to the Pentagon, by a woman called Charlotte Webb, who worked between the UK and the US. And after reading that, I read another book, as is, this is how writers work, I think, is we find something to obsess over and then we just completely dive down the rabbit hole. Mm-hmm. Anyway, I read a book called Code Girls by Liza Mundy, which came out about 2017. And there was a line in that book when, in the first few chapters, when she talked about the cryptography facilities in the States. And that line was, in 1927, there was a girls' school, a finishing school for young ladies just outside of Washington, DC. And in June of 1942, the US Army bought the school to use as a signals intelligence facility. And I was like, that's it. That's my in, that's my entry point for the story. So this kind of moldering old mansion, I guess, is what you would describe it as, with these glorious columns out the front, these big white columns. And it had stables, it had elocution rooms, it had libraries, it had its own equestrian area. It had places where girls could practice their dancing and their posture and all of this sort of thing. And then they turned it into a signal intelligence facility. And yeah, as soon as I read that line, I was like, yeah, this is me. This is what I want to write about.
And, I remember when I first started reading The Killing Code and Arlington Hall is introduced, and I messaged you and said, oh, this is an interesting fictitious place that you made up in the area where I grew up. I grew up mostly in Fairfax, Virginia, which is like a stone's throw from Arlington. And you said, oh, no, this is a real place. This is a real thing. And it blew my mind because I had never heard anything about this. So can you tell us a little bit about, I'm interested in the real Arlington Hall, how it was used in World War II, and what kinds of roles women played in spy games and code breaking in World War II. You know, like you paint this picture in your book of a whole team of women who are helping to crack codes, which is an amazing thing to read about. So how close to the truth do you get in your book, and how much did you have to invent?
Oh my goodness. This is such, well, first of all, I was really delighted when you said that, that you'd never heard of Arlington Hall. And I was like, well, I mean, for one, I was like, well, if you grew up in the area, you must know about it. And then I realized, no, of course you wouldn't, because Arlington Hall still exists and it's part of the NSA. So it's now, so it's now, a US Army and training facility, and it is a strategic site of NSA, National Security Agency work. So I don't imagine a lot of people are allowed in there, or even, I don't imagine that they advertise their presence, put it that way. Signal intelligence is still a big deal. And even though it's worked on in different ways now, it's still a really critical part of national defense in every country in the world. So I imagine that they're keeping things locked up pretty tight still at Arlington Hall. But in terms of, well, what was it like? They actually retained pretty much all of the original old facade of the mansion. So these big ionic columns in the front, this big circular driveway. There were some smaller buildings, some outbuildings, some made of stone, some of wood. Everything was kind of painted white and looked very beautiful, and manicured lawns and things like that. But they just built a giant fence around it. And then as soon as the whole site was repurposed by the US Army, they started building barracks as well for not just the military police who were housed on site and working on site, but also for some of the young women who were working there. Because Bletchley Park, like Arlington Hall, had a workforce that was pretty much 70% female. And the bulk of the people who worked on code breaking during World War II were women, were young women. And they were quite young. When we say quite young, I originally thought, oh, it'll be between 18 and 25. And that was about right. That was my guesstimate, was about right. The average age of the women who worked at Bletchley Park, for instance, was about 19. So it was quite fascinating to think about how these women had come straight out of teacher training colleges, straight out of universities, and they had also been hired, not only a couple of years after they'd finished school themselves. A lot of these young women had come out of high school, spent a year learning how to become teachers, and then gone into schools as female school teachers. And they were the people that the US Army was interested in recruiting. So when Arlington Hall was set up in June of 42, it had an existing workforce because, in September 1941, so even a few months before the US officially joined the World War, Pearl Harbor happened in December of 41. They had already been sending out secret letters to the female professors of women's colleges and teaching universities, and to young women who they thought would be eligible for a program like this. And so they all started flooding in as soon as the place was set up. They all started arriving and set to work on 24-hour shift rotations. And that was how it went.
And so what kinds of things were they looking for in female recruits?
Well, the first thing that they asked was, they always asked two questions at first, was, did you like crosswords? And are you engaged to be married? Because
that old chestnut.
Yeah, that old chestnut. And I think the engaged to be married part wasn't so much that they didn't want to take women who were already connected to somebody, in terms of they didn't want to take married women. I think it was more to do with the fact that they were looking for single people. You know, they were looking for people who were unconnected, who were unlikely to talk outside of the circle that they lived in. They didn't have a spouse that they might confide in. Secrecy was considered really, really paramount. And the other interesting thing that I found out about women who worked in code breaking in that era was, I mean, when I first started researching this book, I thought, oh, this is going to be really hard. The code breaking is going to be really hard to write, because I myself am not good at maths. Okay. I am really, in fact, I am like the anti-maths person. My numbers really do not exist very well in my brain at all. And I remember when I was doing the research and said I wanted to write the book, another author friend of mine, Lily Wilkinson, said, oh, I really wanted to write a book about code breaking ladies, but I just couldn't face the maths. And I was thinking, oh no, this is going to be really bad. How am I going to write the maths parts? But then I realized that actually, while they did recruit women from STEM areas, from the maths and sciences, like they engaged women who had done very well in obviously pure mathematics and chemistry and physics and related subjects like astronomy. Those were women that they employed first. That they, after a while though, they started to get really desperate and they started bringing in women from all over. And in fact, they recruited a lot of women who had skills in other areas, languages, music, poetry. And in fact, one of the most successful recruits that they ever took on was Anne Cara Christie, who came from the humanities. She was an English and humanities major. And then she went on to become one of the most successful code breakers of Allied signal intelligence.
Wow. How fascinating. Well, and then I imagine because a lot of it is about patterns.
Yes.
Finding patterns and correlations between things. And you don't necessarily have to be a math whiz to be good at that.
No, it's about pattern recognition. And it's also about close attention to detail and having a lot of patience. You know, it was really actually very boring work. I mean, if you can imagine starting your shift at 8 and finishing at 4, and for the entire time you're sitting at a little wooden desk with probably a dozen other women all crammed in together on these hard wooden chairs, and you're pouring through little scraps of paper, basically, or sheets of paper that you have to compare and see which row of numbers has the same. So it was about pouring through these transcripts that they would receive, and they would receive thousands of them every day. It was a very menial type of job. And in fact, that's probably one of the reasons why women were originally favored for this position, because it was a menial job that required a lot of patience.
And that's another thing that I've been wondering about. Obviously, we're talking about a particular era.
Yes.
a time gone by. And so a time at which women perhaps would not have been the first choice, you know, the government's first choice for who should fill these positions doing what was really important work. So why is it that the government decided to recruit women? Was it because so many men were going overseas to war? Was it, you know, what were kind of the factors there that came together to open up this opportunity for women?
You basically hit the nail on the head there. It's because so many men had gone to war. And it made it possible for women to become instrumental at every stage of defense industry work. It was for the first time, they just didn't have the capacity to fill these roles without women. And in fact, employing women became a complete necessity. So women actually flooded in to Washington, DC during that period of time. More than 200,000 women. Yeah, I know, it was crazy. So Washington, DC actually started off as kind of this sleepy kind of capital. And then people like Cindy Gwaley, who wrote a book called Lipstick Brigade, that's what they used to call the women who worked in these war roles. They called them the Lipstick Brigade. Yeah, I know. Isn't it great? And she talked about how Washington, D.C. turned into this boom town overnight. So women became the backbone of all the federal agencies and all of the war departments. And it was a period of, immense social change generally. I mean, women came into these roles. Quite often they weren't being paid at the same rate that men would have been paid in these roles. So that was already, a little bit interesting that they were happy to take on women, but only at reduced wages.
Nice.
But also there was a lot of mixed emotions about women participating in the war effort. There was a lot of mixed emotions about women being recruited and leaving their homes and leaving their families. The bulk of these women who came in were single women. So, and they came from all over the country. That the war departments had sent out a call saying you should take on these jobs. So women stepped out, and for a lot of them, it was the first time that they'd ever left home, that they'd ever left their hometown, that they left their parents and gone to work elsewhere. And it was a really big deal. So they were welcomed in Washington, D.C., but they were also resented in a lot of ways because they were taking a job that would normally have been held by a man, that they were taking a job and taking a leap of faith in a lot of ways by leaving their hometowns and, leaving their families at the start of every day in factories and then come home. And also there was this weird kind of psychological situation where the phrase that was used to encourage women to join up was called release a man to fight. So you were encouraged to release a man to go and fight, but at the same time there was an awareness that you were releasing a man to potentially die. So there was a lot of really profound and weird psychological stuff happening for both the women who took on those jobs and for the society, I think, at large in Washington, D.C.
For sure. And this is an era, too, when certainly there were young women who were living alone, but it was still considered a little bit suspect to have a whole bunch of unmarried women living together or living alone, making their own wage, doing their own thing, especially during such a fraught time.
100%. Absolutely true. And in fact, there were a number of politicians who tried to pass rules around the way women could behave when they were living in Washington, D.C., of course.
Of course they did. This is like a tale as old as time, let me tell you.
And I think there was one senator who came out and said that they should institute a curfew for all Washington, D.C. government girls, that they should be home by, 9 every night. And well, for one, that was repudiated very quickly. That law never got off the ground because, for one, these women were working 24-hour shifts. So having them home in bed at like 9 o'clock every night was completely impractical to the kinds of jobs that they were performing. But also it was something that, in fact, one of the only, I think it might have been the only female senator in Washington at the time, got up and said, look, you're treating these women who've taken on roles, often, having moved all the way across the country to take on these jobs that you want them to do. You're treating them like children, and you can't do that. It's not acceptable.
No, but But Ellie, if you don't give them a curfew, they're going to go out and get
They're
drunk
gonna
and
go
have
wild.
premarital
I
sex.
know.
Society will crumble.
Society will absolutely crumble. I mean, if women are allowed to go out and wear pants for the first time, oh my God. Or,
Yeah, because that was still like pretty racy at
oh,
this period, women wearing
absolutely.
pants, like big
It
time
was a really
still.
big deal. Wearing pants and earning their own money and working outside the home, all of these incredible things that could happen. You just don't know what's going on with all these
Yeah.
women who are hotbedding. I mean, the situation in Washington D.C. was kind of hilarious at the time as well, because for me it was very interesting because having researched Bletchley Park, England was going through a period of terrible deprivation. They had heavy rationing around everything from food to clothing to footwear to how much oil and gas you could use to power your car or heat your home. So people were growing their own food in their backyards. They had victory gardens. So it was and everyone was everything was kind of a bit bleak. In the UK, they'd also been under heavy bombardment. So that was, something really serious that was happening in England. They felt this sense of imminent threat. Whereas when you're looking at the situation in Washington, D.C., despite Pearl Harbor, there was a feeling of threat, but there was still this sense that life was still going on. Rationing was on, but things were still moving. And there was a huge black market, an underground black market for things that people could and couldn't get. So, there was this real sense that Washington, D.C. was thriving, and it was a pretty cool place to be. You could go out
and you get to see that. Yeah, you get to see that in the Killing Code. Some of my favorite scenes in the book are when the girls go out to a function, a party, or they go to a bar. They go to I mean, it's amazing. It's amazing to see them go out to these places where there is a sense that war is on, but also Washington, D.C. is bumping. Like it's an incredible opportunity for these young girls to go out and have a good time.
Have freedom for some of them, the first time in their lives, to go out and buy like 2 martinis for $1 and listen to some of the best music, some of the best swing and jazz music that, had ever been heard in Washington, D.C., I imagine. And to dress up in some clothes that, came up past your knee. Your skirts were a little bit shorter because fabric was being rationed. So skirts were a little bit shorter, and the nights were a little bit longer. And people used to go out and congregate together. Women used to go out in big groups and congregate together. There was still dancing, there was still plays and musicals and sporting events and things like that. So there was a real sense that Washington, D.C. was really lively, and it was a pretty cool place to go and be. Women were sharing everything. They would share clothes, they would swap nail polish, they would share makeup around because lipstick was often in hot demand. And of course, they were desperate for places to stay because finding accommodation was really, really difficult. And in fact, women would hotbed. So they would, it was kind of like a timeshare arrangement where one woman would come in and use the room and the bed in that room for the day shift while she had her, time off, and then she would go to work, and then the woman who'd had the night shift before her would come in, had the day shift before her, would come in and use the bed for the night. So it was always, there was so many thousands more people on the streets than you would be used to, and it was I just loved it. Researching it was fascinating. I found out all of these weird details. Women used to draw stocking seams on with eyebrow pencils because stockings were really, really hard to get.
I love that.
I know.
Because there were a lot of materials that were going towards the war effort. I mean, a lot of materials. And I think, this is floating around in my brain, and you can correct me because I'm sure I've got it wrong, but nylon was being used for something.
Parachutes. You needed nylon for parachutes, and they were really important. So they didn't have enough nylon to make stockings as well. And silk, you couldn't get silk stockings because silk came from Japan. So that was a no-no. So what they used to do was, and this was really hilarious, they would paint gravy on their legs before they would.
What?
Yeah, seriously.
That's the best historical tidbit I've ever heard.
They actually had, I know, isn't it wild? They actually had in the department stores, they would have demonstrations for how to apply this kind of brown gravy liquid. And if you didn't have the brown liquid, you could use just gravy powder basically at home to your legs in an even way. So it looked like you were wearing stockings, and then get your girlfriend to write, like put a line down the back of your leg with the eyeliner pencil, so it looked like you were wearing stockings, because you couldn't go out without them.
No, right. No, you couldn't. I mean, they was still like, you didn't go out bare-legged. You had to wear stockings.
Absolutely.
So get out that gravy, ladies. So speaking of amazing historical tidbits like that, I know you came across tons as you were researching for the Killing Code. So can you give us some of your favorite tidbits about, the girls at Arlington Hall, or just other things about the era for women that you found really interesting or surprising?
There were a million weird things.
I can't wait. Tell me all of them. Tell me all 1 million.
If I gave you all 1 million, we would be here literally all day. But look, they came from all over the place. That was the thing that I found really interesting, was that these women came from all over. And that signal intelligence operations were happening all over the globe, I mean, when I posted something on social media about the research that I'd done for this book, I got a number of responses from people local to me who were talking about the women who worked in signal intelligence in Melbourne, in Australia. And one woman told me that he used to deliver the intercepts that needed to be broken, which had codes that needed to be broken, to Moorabbin Airport in Melbourne. I don't know if this will be interesting to Australian listeners, because they used to have a girl who would tuck all of these intercepts into a satchel and then ride on a motorbike all the way down St Kilda Road to get these intercepts to Victoria Barracks, where they had the crypto facilities for special, and what they used to call special intelligence in Melbourne. So that fascinated me, that this was happening in places all over the globe, that women had come in the US from all over America to center in this area in Washington DC for the work that they were doing. And that in one room, in one code breaking unit, I guess, because they were all on the same shifts together. So, you would become very close with the women who worked on the same desk with you or in the same unit with you. And quite often you would be sharing a bed or a, bunk sharing, or sharing a house or a room with the women that you're working with as well. So they became very, very connected to one another. And so you would have women, from New Jersey, women from California, women from Wisconsin, and they were all, everybody was working in the same place. It was a time when women had this solidarity, that they could share gossip, that they could share information about their styles of living, the types of food they were eating. It was just an amazing opportunity for women to become very collegial. And, while I did read a lot of information about people like Alan Turing, in Bletchley Park, I mean, everybody knows Alan Turing's name. He's renowned as the guy who broke the Enigma code, and made huge advances in code breaking and in computing. And so we have this, I could tell you a really weird detail about Turing, which is that at Bletchley Park, there was this lake. There was this ornamental lake just outside the huts where all of the code breakers used to work. And he was working in one of these particular huts. And he would go out when he couldn't figure out a problem. He would go out and walk around the lake with a cup of tea. And then as soon as somebody got a break, they would run out and call out to him. And instead of He was a very odd person. And instead of like bringing his cup with him or putting it down under a tree or something like that, he used to throw it in the lake. So so when they closed down Bletchley Park, they like cleaned up the whole area and turned it into a museum. And they obviously they drained the lake to clean it out and, you know, beatify it. And they found literally hundreds of cups, like old teacups that he'd like thrown into the lake. So that was really odd. And so, look, we do know a lot about Turing and about his life, but we have this strong idea of the towering Titanic genius who works alone. You know, this single individual who's almost invariably male, and who cracks the code or makes the break or drives this in this focus that allows, you know, rapid advances to happen. But in fact, for the women who worked in these facilities and for the bulk of the workforce, it wasn't about that. It wasn't about a single person. It was about collectivity. It was about collaboration. And the women were amazingly collegial. They worked very closely together. As I said, quite often they lived together. And you know, for them, code breaking was a gigantic team effort. They used to call it like a crew job. So, you know, that was why places like Arlington Hall were set up that way, because the women, you know, in one room, there would be 25, 30, 40 of them all in one room. And maybe one of them would get part of a break. And then another girl on the other table, she would get part of it. And then somebody else would get another part of it. And then they would all club together to make these advances in the code. So that was the part that I really loved. And I also loved that they used to go out together and hang out. And they would go out, you know, like Oklahoma, the musical Oklahoma. It debuted in March of 1943. So, you know, that was something that they used to go out and see in Washington, DC. They would go to the musicals. And there was a wonderful story from Code Girls about how when they used to go out together, they would have a code of their own. So that if any one of them were at the bar and they ordered a vodka Collins, that meant that somebody had taken too close an interest in their work, because of course they weren't allowed to talk about it. Mm-hmm. So they used to, that was their code, so that they used to all scatter to the women's bathrooms and then they would all leave separately.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
I love that. So they were even doing, you know, spy work when they were out at the bar.
Yeah.
had to have a drink code. I don't think I've ever had a vodka Collins. Have you?
No, I've never had one, but I'm tempted to have one.
Yeah. We might have to make them together. Next time we're together, we'll have to make them and see if they're any good.
They sound tempting.
That was one of the things that I really loved about the book, is there is this sense of camaraderie and sisterhood and these women working together and celebrating each other's victories. It's not about competition. It's about we're all working towards a joint goal and we can only do it together, which is not just in the code breaking room. It's also in the story that you're telling, in the murder mystery that these girls get very much wrapped up in and are working together to solve. So can you tell us a little bit about your Code Girls? Can you introduce us to them?
I love my Code Girls. And yes, you're right. That was something I really wanted to emphasize in the book, was that these four girls, particularly around, you know, this mystery that they're trying to solve, this murder investigation that they're trying to bring to justice, that for them, it was really about the friendship and really about that camaraderie that they needed to have, and that it was critical for them to have in order to actually make this work. So like their sisters who are working in the code breaking rooms, they had to really band together. So my Code Girls are Kit Sutherland. So Kit is a girl who is not who she seems. She's holding on to a big secret. She is an imposter. So she's taken on a different identity in order to become a code breaker. So that was something I was really excited about when I realized that I would not only be writing about code breaking, but I would also be writing and weaving in all of these details about how Kit has to code switch in daily life. And that was really important for her character, that she's come from a lower class background and she's suddenly mixing with, you know, middle class and upper middle class women who'd come into these roles, and she's impersonating someone who comes from an upper middle class background. So she does a lot of code switching in the way she changes her accent, in the way she dresses, and the way she presents, her turns of phrase. All of those are things that she has to always be aware of constantly to maintain this disguise. And then she bunks with another girl called Dottie, who comes from Baltimore and who is pretty much friendly to everybody. She's the daughter of a grocer. And Dottie is delightful.
She is. She's just a ray of sunshine. I love her.
She is. She's really bouncy. She's got these golden curls, and she has this really, well, she gets described as naive a couple of times, but she has this be nice to everybody and they'll be nice to you type approach to the world, I think. And so for her, this is not only, you know, something that she's feels strongly about, that she has to help investigate this murder mystery because she was on site when the first murder occurred. But also, you know, for her, it's a bit of a mystery that, you know, someone would want to do something like this. So, you know, for her, I guess the story is about opening up to the world and some of the darker sides of the world and learning to find balance in that. And then there's Violet, who is one of the Black codebreakers who works at Arlington Hall. And that's something we haven't had a chance to talk about yet. But
yeah, we definitely will. We're going to be talking about that. So keep going, and I promise.
You want me to keep going?
Yeah, you keep going, and I promise we'll circle back to that because I really want to talk about that.
Okay, so Violet comes from a middle-class Black family who, you know, they've kind of worked their way up in the world. And when she was originally working at Arlington Hall as a kitchen worker, so that was, you know, what she was originally there for. And then she is recruited into the segregated unit of the code breaking systems at Arlington Hall by a guy called William Coffey, who we should talk about too when we discuss that. And then, of course, once she moves from you know, domestic labor into an area where she's using her mind, and she's earning a little bit more money, and she has a little bit more personal freedom, suddenly she realizes that she can't go back. She can't go back to domestic work after doing something like this. It's changed her perspective on the world. And at that time, you know, a lot of Black people's perspective on the world was being changed by the slowly increasing influence of the civil rights movement. And so, yeah, her personal changes, I guess, are meant to reflect the social changes that were happening at the time. And then finally, we have Moya, who is the floor 3 supervisor. So she's a young woman. She's only like a year or two older than the rest of the women that she's supervising, but she's very glamorous. She has an amazing armoire, this wardrobe full of gorgeous clothes.
Her outfits are the best, I think.
I had so much fun writing the clothes for this book. Oh my goodness. And Moya has the best selection of outfits because she wears her clothes like armor. She comes from working class background in New York City, and she has pulled herself up by her bootstraps, and now she is working in a position of some responsibility at Arlington Hall. She liaises with the upper echelons of administration. She feels a strong sense of responsibility to the women in her care, and she really cares for them. You know, she really wants to see them do well. So for her, the fact that one of her code girls gets murdered is like a personal affront. And Moya is just so gorgeous. She puts on her clothes every morning like she's putting on a suit of armor, and she does her makeup perfectly, and she does her hair perfectly, and she goes out to kind of do battle with her outfits, and I just adored her.
She is very fierce and a little bit mysterious and just generally very wonderful. So
yeah.
we will return to her in a moment, but let's actually circle back and talk a little bit about Violet and about the role that Black women played in code breaking in World War II. What kinds of things did you find in your research?
Well, the first thing I found was that it was actually really hard to find information about the segregated code breaking unit at Arlington Hall and about the work of Black code breakers at all. It was actually, it was like their names were just forgotten or left off the records because they weren't considered important. And, you know, that's for one, is a complete tragedy. We have the names of some significant women who worked in that unit. Geneva Arthur was one of them. And, you know, that unit probably wouldn't have existed without the changes in legislation that occurred at that time, because Franklin Delano Roosevelt, of course, was president, and he had to issue a ban on discrimination in the defense industries during the war, in order to just get enough employees, so that they actually needed Black workers as much as they needed women, you know. And in order to do that, they had to pass some new laws facilitating the entry of Black workers into defense industries and into the military. And this was to some extent driven as well by Eleanor Roosevelt. So FDR's wife, she was pushing very hard for changes to make it possible for Black people to be employed in the defense industries. And then when that legislation came through, I mean, it was a real opening up to an extent that hadn't really been seen before. And of course, at that time too, there was a lot of simmering, bubbling movements underneath the surface of the society in Washington, DC. There was, for instance, the threatened March on Washington in 1941, where, you know, that was something that the Black leaders at the time had said, well, we're going to march on Washington to demand equality and employment in the defense industries. And really was just the threat of that happening. That march never happened because the administration backed down and allowed Black workers into the army and into the military. And so consequently, suddenly Black people were very visible. They were demanding equal places at lunch counters, and, you know, they didn't want to be confined to the back of the bus any longer. So it was a really important time. It was the start, I guess, of the civil rights movement that really exploded in the you know, late 50s, early 60s. So the segregated unit at Arlington Hall was founded by a guy called William Coffey, who was originally hired at the hall as a janitor.
Wow.
I know. Yeah. So he was one of the new intake Black workers that they put on at the time, because they had to meet certain quotas for Black workers within the defense industries.
Yes. And don't give him a job breaking any codes or, you know, doing anything considered important. No, he can sweep up the trash. Yikes.
You sweep up the trash. But then, of course, what they discovered was that they had too much work to cover. There was a whole section of code breaking that no one had really been looking at, and that was the commercial channels. You know, like the US was still engaged in international contracts with companies like Mitsubishi from Japan, and nobody was checking the messages that were being passed back and forth along those commercial channels. And so suddenly somebody at Arlington Hall in conjunction with the US Army said, well, we still need to be keeping an eye on this stuff. And they were like, well, we're completely overworked. We're swamped with the regular intercepts that are coming in. What are we going to do? So they actually gave William Coffey the role of, because he'd been working as a janitor and assistant, they said, well, you could recruit some Black people to do this job. And that's what he did. He just took over that whole unit and recruited all of these Black women. A number of them who'd originally started out as domestic laborers. And so there they were working in a segregated area. They weren't allowed into the main part of Arlington Hall. They had to work in an old cottage out the back of the hall, what used to be the old principal's house. Yeah, I know. And we still just
I'm rolling my eyes, listeners. Rolling
yeah,
my eyes.
I know. I can hear you sighing.
Yeah.
And they were working away there, and they actually were very instrumental in ensuring that those channels remained safe. And then a number of the women who worked in that unit, there were some connections later between the women who worked and achieved success in the Black segregated unit at Arlington Hall and what was called the NACA back then, which became NASA, of course. And if you've seen the film Hidden Figures, you'll know that a number of Black women worked behind the scenes as Black computers at NASA. And so women who'd kind of cut their teeth on code breaking during World War II, some of them made the shift over to NASA, to the NACA, to work in these roles. So it was an amazingly fertile unit and it was a unique opportunity for the women that worked there. And we just don't have enough information about it, quite frankly.
No, well, let's hope that it's out there and someone really, really needs to dig in and write us a book so we can talk about it.
I would love to see a book. I would love to see a book written about this unit because so much of it was a mystery. So, you know, if you're willing to dig into that information, what is available, and dig up more, you could write a great book.
Young historians, I know you're listening. Get into it. And then come on the Exploress and let's talk about it.
I mean, the other interesting thing about Arlington Hall was that, well, I mean, you asked me about weird tidbits before. I mean, the US Army and the US Navy during World War II, they hated each other. You know that, right? So that's why they ended up having separate units for US Army in Arlington Hall, and the US Navy had its own code breaking unit in North Washington. So
this is what happens
really
when
hilarious.
you let men run the show. That's all I'm saying.
I mean, it would have been, look, I'm saying it's hilarious. I mean, it would have been hilarious if they hadn't been in the middle of a world war.
Right.
But then Anne Cara Christie became one of the leading lights of the US Army unit in Arlington Hall. And she later became the first female deputy director of the NSA. So that was, you know, it was interesting to me to see where all of these women ended up, because, you know, I was able to track some of them through the Veterans History Project, through the Library of Congress, has a lot of interviews with Anne Cara Christie, which is really fascinating. And also the NSA has a wonderful series of oral history interviews. And they interviewed people like Wilma Berryman, who later became Wilma Davis. And these women, you know, were critical to the code breaking of the war. And some of them went on to become quite important. I mean, Cara Christie became really important within the NSA. She was one of the first people who encouraged the NSA to embrace the use of computers as they were coming up, you know, in the 70s and 80s. And yeah, so she made some really significant changes in the NSA. And of course, she passed away, and everybody was attending her funeral, that they realized that her longtime companion was actually her partner. So she was a queer woman who worked at Arlington Hall and then worked in the NSA for a long time as a queer woman, and everybody just kind of knew but didn't talk about it, or it was just something that wasn't talked about.
Speaking of which, I think we should talk a little bit about queer women code breakers in the Killing Code, because
yes,
I mean, the major romance, the romantic thread that runs through the book is a relationship between two of these women. So
Yes.
can you tell us, I mean, obviously no spoilers, but can you tell us a little bit about that relationship, why that relationship was important for you to include in the book, and just a little bit about how you thought about portraying this relationship between these two young women in a time when such things weren't really discussed. Obviously, they were happening, but they weren't being publicly discussed.
Well, I think that's the thing I think that you've hit on, which is that they were happening, while they may not have been talked about much, they were definitely romances between women at that time. Whether there were any in Arlington Hall, I mean, we already know that Anne Cara Christie was queer, and that she and her partner were working together at Arlington Hall. So yeah, I mean, I think it's fairly undeniable that queer romances were happening, and I just thought it just never occurred to me that it wouldn't be possible to incorporate a queer romance. It just made total sense to have all of these girls living in this hothouse environment. And of course, there would be romances happening. Of course, girls would fall in love with each other. So I thought, well, that seemed like a completely natural thing to include. So yeah, when Kit and Moya's romance over the course of the book seems like something that that came out very easily, very naturally when I was writing. And I also think it was really important to include it as well, because during the 40s and during World War II, when all of these young women were pouring into Washington, DC, it turned into a really important time for queer women. How it was an era where for the first time women could wear pants and congregate with other women. And so consequently, for a lot of queer women, it was the first time they could pass unnoticed or unremarked in public. It wasn't considered weird that they were earning their own money, that they had their own job, that they're developing a career as an independent woman. It was something that was considered completely normal. I mean, one of the things I should mention is that, I said that 200,000 young women poured into Washington, DC. A lot of them were single. Over half of them stayed post-war, so it was a time of change for women's personal identities generally. And for queer women, it was a time of relatively open camaraderie and acceptance that they had never experienced before. There was obviously a great deal of difficulty still in conducting relationships. You had to be very discreet. There was, certain things that you couldn't say in public. And of course, expressing interest and reciprocating interest, that would have been all very coded. And again, going back to the idea of code switching, there were certain codes or signals that you had to be aware of when you were taking an interest in somebody. I think too, it was something that homosexuality was still considered a mental illness during the 40s, and you could be disqualified from military service if you were found out. You were given a Section 8. So it was something that women were still very aware of. But it was also a time of unique flowering of representation in terms of women's bars. Lesbian nightclubs started up. Women could go out together, buy each other a drink, dance together, and because of the shortage of men, it wasn't considered particularly unusual. Last Night at the Telegraph Club is another excellent book by Melinda Lowe. It won the National Book Award in 2021, and that talks about the aftermath of the war and lesbian nightclubs in the 1950s in San Francisco. And that is a great, if you like The Killing Code, this would be a good follow-up. There was a backlash during the 50s for queer women. But it really did spark the beginning of a movement of community and solidarity that I think probably culminated eventually in, situations like Stonewall. What was quite hilarious was, do you know that the WWII, so the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, became a thing during World War II, and you'll find this little tidbit quite hilarious, which is that they wanted to do a promotional campaign for the WAAC. So they actually picked out a woman called Phyllis Abry and to be the face of the WAAC, and she was fairly openly lesbian, and they picked another woman to be with her for the promotional shots, and it turned out to be her partner, Mildred.
Amazing.
So Phyllis Abry and Mildred ended up being the face of the ideal WAAC woman. So
I bet they loved that secretly.
They loved that.
Oh, that is so good. I love that.
And I mean, it just seemed really obvious to me that romance would be an integral part of the killing code, and that Kit and Moya would fall in love. So yeah.
Yeah, and and I love it. I mean, the romance is just wonderful, and the book is just filled with so many things I love and that I know you'll love, listeners. There's lots of feminism. There's lots of girls punching the patriarchy and doing interesting things. It's like a diverse crew of women who are smart and capable and interesting, and they are trying to track down someone who's killing girls just like them, which is just, it's gripping. It'll keep you on the edge of your seat. It's all the good things. So run out to your library or your local independent bookstore or wherever you find your books and pick up a copy.
Thank you so much. That's so nice.
Of course. Well, you know how much I love the book, Ellie, and I was so excited that we got to talk today about your Code Girls and Code Girls in general. You taught me a lot of things I didn't know, and I'm kind of thinking of going and getting some gravy powder and trying out this stocking trick.
We can try out the gravy powder trick and get a vodka Collins together. I think those two in combination might work really well.
That sounds like a date to me. Oh, well, thank you so much, Ellie.
Thank you so much for having me, Kate. It's been delightful to be on the Exploress.
Thanks for listening, and thanks so much to Ellie for joining us. The Killing Code is out right now, and you'll find it wherever books are sold. There are lots of ways to support the Exploress. Tell a friend about it, leave a review wherever you listen, become a patron, or just send me an email telling me what you love best about the show. You can find show notes for this and every episode at my website, which includes images, interesting links, and a full transcript at theexploresspodcast.com. You can find me on Instagram at The Exploress Podcast and occasionally on Facebook and Twitter at The Exploress Pod. Until next time.